Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Richard Peters, President of the Boston Medical Library. I would like to welcome you to this Zoom presentation of our 17th Estes lecture. The Boston Medical Library was refounded in 1875 by physicians including Dr. Henry Ingersoll Bowditch, an internist and public health pioneer, Dr. James Reed Chadwick, gynecologist and our first librarian, and Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes, the autocrat of the breakfast table, who served as our first president. It was founded to be a public library to make books and journals accessible to the practicing physician. It evolved to have a large collection of antique medical books, including ancient manuscripts and hundreds of incunabula, which are books printed in Europe before 1500. J. Worth Estes was a professor of pharmacology at Boston University School of Medicine and an accomplished medical historian. He served as editor of the Journal of the History of Medicine and Allied Sciences and authored several books and numerous articles on the subject. This lecture was established to honor his memory. I would like to thank my colleagues on the Estes Selection Committee for their help in developing ideas for this lecture. And now I would like to turn the podium over to Dr. Scott Padalski to introduce our speaker. Dr. Padalski is a primary care physician at Massachusetts General Hospital, professor of global health and social medicine at Harvard, and director of the Center for the History of Medicine at the Countway Medical Library. Dr. Padalski.
Thanks so much, Rick. So it's my pleasure to get to introduce Anne Harrington, whom I've learned from and looked up to since my own undergraduate days as a history and science concentrator at Harvard. She's the Franklin L. Ford Professor of the History of Science at Harvard, the former chair of the History of Science Department, and currently its Director of Undergraduate Studies. She also has the honor of serving as the faculty dean of one of Harvard's residential communities, Pforzheimer House. Dr. Harrington is a long-standing leader in attempting to rigorously examine the relationship between the mind and brain and among psychiatry, neurology, and neuroscience, and is the former head of Harvard's Mind, Brain, and Behavior Initiative. Along these lines, she's the author of 4 books that range across the brain and mind sciences and engage with the tension between reductionism and holism in a range of times and settings. Her books include Medicine, the Mind, and the Dual Brain, which is from 1987, Re-Enchanted Science, Holism in German Culture, from Wilhelm II to Hitler, which is from 1997, and The Cure Within, A History of Mind-Brain Medicine, which is from 2007. And this brings us to her current book, Mind Fixers, Psychiatry's Troubled Search for the Biology of Mental Illness. It's more than even its ambitious title suggests, and is really, at the same time, a remarkable overview of the multiple threads of psychiatry over the past century plus, of the tension and at times complementarity between biological and psychological rationales and treatments for mental illness, and of the forces internal and external to the medical profession in driving all this. In her book, Dr. Harrington uses extensive research to overturn a number of existing narratives, and we'll get to hear tonight about a particularly relevant part of this history, the, quote, 1980s biological revolution in psychiatry, what really happened, and what really happened next. So Dr. Harrington.
Thank you. Let me now do my own version of the screen share. So hopefully everyone can see the title slide, and I want to just start by thanking so many people for coming out. And even though we're not in a live space and I can't really see any of you guys, no, I guess you can see me. I'd like to find a way to make this feel a little bit interactive. We have opened the chat function, and while I won't be able to monitor it completely, consistently as I go through the lecture, I would encourage you to sort of share your thoughts or questions as we go along, and we can then use it. Your sort of thought bubbles. We can use it as a basis for a hopefully genuine conversation when I wrap up. And let me then move right into what I want to do. It's to start by telling you a story. The story I want to tell you is a familiar one. At least it's a familiar one to people in the field of psychiatry, because they tell it a lot. It goes like this. For decades, American psychiatry was lost in a Freudian wilderness. It had lost its connection to medicine. It was in the thrall of fantastical theories, ineffective treatment practices, hobbled by an incredibly sloppy approach to diagnostics. This went on year after year until sometime in the late 1970s, 1980s, just as things could hardly get worse, some heroes arrived. These heroes were researchers in biochemistry, in brain science, who were armed with new science, new treatments, who offered the field a different medicine-based way forward. And they, arriving with all this new science, these new treatments, made clear the Freudian dinosaurs had to go. And the Freudians, now outed, as you see here in this 1984 article, as the bumbling stepchildren of modern science that they were, they left. The world celebrated. Psychiatry has never looked back since. That's the basic story. The version that you're looking at on this slide is an early version. It was aired, as you see here, in 1984 in a multi-part newspaper spread about the new biological psychiatry, which inspired the title of my book. The journalistic series was called The Mind Fixers, and it was all about these new guys who were cleaning shop and moving psychiatry into the future. It won a Pulitzer Prize for long-form journalism the following year. So that's 1984, and in the years since 1984, this story continued to make the rounds. With time, the story would take on new elements. In a few years, there was a new strand that was introduced, which insisted that Emil Kraepelin, the German anatomist, actually was the father of modern psychiatry, not Freud, but this only became clear once we had thrown out the Freudians. If you pick up textbooks in biological psychiatry or dealing with disorders like schizophrenia, you continue to see these narratives. I've showing you here little excerpts from a couple of recent textbooks, and I invite you, as you look at this slide, to notice the loaded language here. Look what they talk about. I can't, if I were on a stage in front of you, I would be taking my laser and doing all sorts of things, and probably I could do this, but I'm afraid I'll, on the screen, but I'm afraid I won't do it right. So I won't do it, but just look where I've underscored. When they're talking about psychoanalysis, words like pseudoscience, inexplicable, eclipse of progress, disastrous. And when talking about the biologist, major advances, a new flowering, vastly increased knowledge, once again now securely a medical discipline. So what's my point? Well, obviously, this story is an effective way to make residents in psychiatry feel pretty good about their own moment. But it has just one big problem. The story's wrong. And it's not just a little wrong. It's wrong in almost all of its particulars. And this matters. It matters more than you might think. I mean, if psychiatry, in fact, were in a really good space, a little self-interested myth-making might not matter that much one way or another, but psychiatry is not in a very good space. It's, in fact, in a fraught, fragile, and divided space. And this isn't what you would expect if the standard story were true. And for this reason, believing in the standard story only confuses us. It makes us harder to understand why we really are where we are. So I've come to believe, as an historian, that to do better challenges to our own moment in mental health care, we need a better story. And this evening, I'd like to try to tell you one. So the story I want to tell starts a little further back in time than you might expect. It starts in the 1980s, it starts not in the 1980s, but in the decades just before World War II. And I start here to set up a kind of a unexpected kind of stage in which we imagine there is not Freudian psychiatry, there's not biological psychiatry, there's a world of an eclectic patchwork of practices and perspectives dominating one area or the other, some biological, some more environmental. We see a world in which the biologically oriented psychiatrists primarily work in state hospitals. They look after the severely, chronically mentally ill. We see a situation in which, while it was true that there had been a tendency for some time to see this branch of psychiatry, hospital psychiatry, as kind of a backwater, the 1930s had also seen a distinct rise in its reputation because in the 1930s, a whole slew of new somatic therapies like shock and surgery were introduced rapid fire into the system. Look, if you look here at these newspaper headlines from the time, it helps you get a sense of how the public was being invited to think about this one-time backwater of psychiatry, think about these developments. And you see that even lobotomies that are today remembered as one of the most barbaric, ill-considered technologies ever employed in the history of psychiatry, were discussed by the press in relatively optimistic ways back then. You can see several worry nerves of brain restore inmates to normal, and so on. Electric shock therapy, a boon to the mentally ill. Now, so while all this is going on in hospital psychiatry, though, there's another group of psychiatrists. These are a group of psychiatrists that are working largely outside the hospital system and who were focused on a very different kind of mission. Their focus was on identifying and treating people who were not yet truly mentally ill, but who were at risk of becoming so. They were focused on people who were called troubled, nervous, neurotic, maladjusted. And there was a general view that the roots of all of these problems, their maladjustment, their troubles, their nervousness, didn't lie in their bad biology. It lay in their bad habits. It lay in their bad neighborhoods. It lay in their bad families. And this suggested that to the extent that that was true, these folk were still salvageable. And to rescue them, therefore, this branch of psychiatry invented a wide range of new institutions and programs, some of which the legacies of which we still live with today. There were new forms of outreach into schools and communities. We have guidance counselors in schools today because of the work of these folks in the 30s. We have new professions like psychiatric social work still around today because of the work of these folks. New institutions like child guidance centers, psychiatric outpatient clinics. By the 1930s, a lot of the psychiatrists involved in all of this work had also discovered psychoanalysis and had started incorporating Freudian ideas about the unconscious, about fantasy, about early childhood trauma into the ways that they were doing their work with all of these folks. Now, through the 1920s and 30s, these two branches of psychiatry coexisted more or less equitably, a little bit uneasily, but they each had their turf. What changed the dynamic here was World War II. And the reason is that when the war came, it was the psychiatrists who were focused on the nearly normal populations of patients who primarily stepped up. Their tools, their approaches seemed far better suited for helping with the epidemic of traumatized soldiers, which this war was producing. Their methods seemed much more appropriate for patching these guys back together again. The techniques they'd used in their outpatient work back home adapted to the wartime situation, things like quick psychotherapy, suggestive therapy, and you look at the extreme optimism with which they described the results. The stuporous became alert, the mute can talk, the deaf can hear, the paralyzed can move. Friends, we are doing a fabulous job taking care of these soldiers. That's what they claimed for themselves, and that was what was widely believed. With the result that after the war was over, they took the position that because they had helped to win the war, in ways, by the way, that their biological colleagues in the hospital hadn't, it was they, not the biological folks, who were now best placed to win the peace. And what they began to say is that the battle mentality that served them so well during the Second World War had to now be applied to the urgent mental health needs of civilians in a dangerous post-war world. We need now, they're saying, to fortify the mental health of a troubled country, a troubled world, all of us. That was psychiatry's most important post-war task. Look at these slides. Look at the slide. Look at the books coming out. Living in a Troubled World. You and psychiatry. The patient was not just the severely mentally ill, and the possibles. It was you and you and you and me. It was all of us. Now, not everyone, certainly the guys in the hospitals, was persuaded by this expansive vision, but there is one critical player that we want to focus on, and that was the federal government, headed in those days by President Truman. And understanding the degree to which he accepted this expansive vision of psychiatry's post-war work also helps us to understand why, when he was persuaded in 1946 to sign legislation that would establish the very first federal agency devoted to psychiatry, the agency was not called the National Institute of Mental Illness. It was not called the National Institute for Insanity. It was called the National Institute of Mental Health. And this signaled the intent of the Institute to realize a far broader mission than a conventionally medical one. And having accepted that should be the vision for post-war psychiatry, Truman naturally looked to the returning war hero psychiatrists to provide leadership for the Institute and set its direction, and they did. So men like Robert Felix, who you see here, he was the first director of the NIMH, he helped ensure that the new NIMH from the beginning, and actually for decades to follow, prioritized not so much the concerns of the old hospital-based psychiatry, but a new progressive social science, psychoanalytic, and policy-inflected research program. He was also key in ensuring that the new federal dollars that were earmarked for training a new generation of psychiatrists were directed towards programs that would emphasize the new progressive vision, emphasize psychoanalytic, environmental, psychotherapeutic approaches. This would ensure that the vision would outlive the founders. What you're looking at here is a photo of a class at the Psychoanalytic Manager Clinic in Topeka, Kansas. This place in the 1950s and 60s got so much funding from the NIMH that it is estimated to have trained as many as 10% of all psychiatrists in the country. And actually for years, a highway sign outside of the town read, "Welcome to Topeka, Kansas, the psychiatric capital of the world." So things were looking and feeling good for the environmentalist, psychoanalytic wing of psychiatry, but not so good for the branch of psychiatry largely associated with hospital medicine, largely associated with biology. Not only had they been largely squeezed out of the new progressive agendas, but they were struggling with a serious decline in their reputation more broadly. Following the very public trials of the Nazi doctors who committed war crimes, for example, it became close to taboo for any American psychiatrist to express an interest in genetic approaches to mental disorders. There had been some wartime revelations about the appalling conditions prevailing in most of the state mental hospitals. This was coincidentally spearheaded by conscientious objectors who worked in these hospitals during the war. But these wartime revelations also reflected badly on the biological wing of psychiatry, since most of them worked in or ran these hospitals. And you're looking here at probably one of the most famous exposés, Bedlam 1946, and the photographs that you're looking at here are designed quite intentionally to evoke memories of photographs of concentration camps. Even the accomplishments that had once won these folks some claim to respectability, the shock treatments, the surgical treatments, were now starting to be trashed by their rivals. The Freudian leadership began to paint them all as old-fashioned, mechanistic, crude, maybe necessary in some cases if you had nothing better at hand, but far, far inferior to psychotherapy. The Freudians, with their psychotherapeutic methods, they had the future in their bones, and they knew it. Or did they? Because then in the mid-1950s, something happens. Something that's going to complicate the story here for both parties. Drugs arrive. There's drugs for schizophrenia, drugs for anxiety, drugs for depression. You see a situation in which uptake of these drugs is pretty much immediate, both in the hospital system and in the general population, especially the anti-anxiety drugs. In fact, by the end of the 1950s, 1 in every 3 prescriptions was for an anti-anxiety tablet. You can see here the Scientific American, 1957, more than 1 billion tablets have been sold. The monthly total of 50 tons falls far short of demand. You see in the store window, it says, yes, we have Milltown. Oops, sorry. Yes, Milltown, one of the first anti-anxiety tablet. Yeah. And that's not all. The arrival of the drugs, especially, it turns out the new antidepressants, inspired some new animal research, particularly based at the NIH, which began to show that these drugs seem to work by altering levels of various newly discovered chemicals in the brain with names like serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine. And the work was elegant, it was important. In fact, one branch of it led in due course to a Nobel Prize, 1971, Julius Axelrod. So what does this all mean? Well, some of you might be thinking at this point, whoa, Harrington, doesn't this mean that the textbooks are right after all? Look at how the tide is turning. Look at how the biologists are coming into their own. But let's consider the facts. All this work happened in the 1950s and early 60s. We don't see declarations of a biological revolution in psychiatry until the 1980s, a full generation later. At the time, no one, or hardly anyone, if there were people, they were pretty quiet, but pretty much no one drew the conclusion that just because there were drugs now, and just because biochemical research had its place now, this meant that biology was all, that people should stop attending to psychosocial aspects of mental illness. No one called for a revolution. On the contrary, an awful lot of energy in these early days went into explaining how the drugs, all this research, actually compatible with a Freudian perspective on mental illness. When the drugs came, when the biochemical research started pounding its way out, the Freudians still stayed in charge. Not only stayed in charge, but flourished. The same years, actually, that saw the invention of psychopharmacology also turned out to be one of the most active, high-profile periods for the Freudian and social science arm of American psychiatry. In fact, following President Johnson's declaration of a war on poverty in 1964, organizations like the NIMH, in spite of the drugs, in spite of the biochemistry, actually ramped up their investment in projects concerned with things like the mental health impacts of poverty, the impacts of urbanism, the roots of violence, management of troubled children, troubled families, and more. Miles Shore, chief of clinical research you're seeing here, what's he studying? The use of puppets in child psychotherapy. Now, among their many projects in these years, the one, though, that I want, of the Freudian projects in these years, the one I want to linger on briefly is this one, because it's going to become very important to where our story goes next. The so-called Community Mental Health Initiative, which envisioned a dramatic recentering of the nation's care of the severely mentally ill away from the state hospital system and towards the so-called community. The state mental hospital system, as we know, had come under withering criticism after World War II. The community envisioned as a warm and personal alternative. You can see Kennedy's language here, talking about how we're going to get these people out of the cold mercy of custodial isolation and welcome them instead into the open warmth of community, concern, and capability. Ironically, though, maybe ironically, the new drugs were a critical part of this vision for community-based care, not because the architects of community mental health had suddenly decided to embrace biological thinking, but because they believed that the drugs would be able to stabilize formerly institutionalized patients sufficiently to make outpatient care a realistic project. And you can see here how Kennedy also talked about that. I've got a little clip from that. the upshot is that by 1963, he'd signed the relevant legislation, and the NIMH began to hand out grants for states to build their community mental health centers. Centers started to get built. The hospitals began to release the patients in great numbers. Optimism is high on all sorts of fronts. The Freudians seemed to be getting the job done. And then trouble started to brew. The 1970s turned out to be a less forgiving decade than the 1960s had been. A bunch of things started to happen, almost all at the same time. For the Vietnam War now, it had become hugely unpopular. Anti-war protests are growing, and in this context, clinicians working at the VA hospitals found themselves accused of covering up for the government's failings by failing to tell the truth about the traumas experienced by soldiers drafted into the war. Really ironic. During the Second World War, these earlier generation of psychiatrists that emerged as heroes, now they're seen as being lackeys for a corrupt government-led war. Feminism is also on the rise. In that context, psychoanalysts suddenly find themselves accused of covering up the scandalous truth of childhood sexual abuse. A radicalized gay community in the early 70s begins to picket outside meetings of the American Psychiatric Association, insisting that they're sick and tired of having their right to love who they want made into a sign of disease. In the late 1960s, a cohort of African-American psychiatrists publicly interrupt a board meeting of the APA and read a list of demands designed to call out the profession's entrenched racism. Multiple critics associated with a movement sometimes called anti-psychiatry began to notice that psychiatry actually didn't seem to be very interested in disease. It didn't seem to be very interested in medical matters at all. Maybe what the field really cared about, some of these folks said, was simply managing social deviance. Maybe there was no such thing as mental illness. Maybe it was just a myth designed by these folks to repress people. And others began to say, well, myth or not, it seems pretty clear that the field had no agreed way of deciding who's really crazy, who's normal. And then as a recession hits the American economy in the mid-1970s, and these kinds of critiques are all in the air, insurance companies begin to ask, why should we reimburse these guys who don't seem to know whether or not patients are really have a disease or not? So that's pretty bad. But the final nail in the coffin for the Freudian leaders comes from the backlash against their most ambitious policy project, the Community Mental Health Initiative. It wasn't working. States were happy to discharge patients, happy to drastically downsize the hospitals that always cost too much anyway, but far fewer community mental health centers were built than expected. Most then ended up underfunded, understaffed. It turned out that the drugs didn't always work to stabilize patients effectively after all, assuming even that the patients decided to still take their medication regularly, and many didn't, because many hated the side effects. The result was that by the late 1970s, it was clear that many mentally ill people who had previously lived in hospitals were now living instead in dreary for-profit boarding houses with little care, or they were living on the streets, or tragically, they were living in jails. Or, if they were lucky, they were living with their aging, overwhelmed parents who felt betrayed by the system, were desperate for better care and resources, and were increasingly becoming pretty angry. And as all these storms whipped around psychiatry, the out-of-power biological wing of the field senses an opportunity. And I would say also, perhaps a sense of responsibility to step up. Enough was enough. The field had gotten itself into all the problems that it had by being both unscientific, by being hubristic. It was time to narrow the gaze. It was time to pull back. It was time to get back to brass tacks. It was time to become medical again, which is another way of saying it was time for them to be in charge. And when you look at how they make their case, when you look carefully at what they're saying, as to why they should be in charge, what becomes clear is that they're not saying they should be in charge because they were in possession of some radical new scientific breakthrough or some radical new scientific treatment. They weren't. All of their best insights were now more than a generation old. Instead, their campaign was waged on a platform of common sense. Of course, psychiatry is a medical profession. Of course, mental illnesses are real diseases. And if they're real diseases, they have a real biology. Of course, exact diagnosis is important. Why the heck could we ever allow ourselves to think differently? Look at this amazing comment by Gerald Clareman, who at that point was very involved in an umbrella organization at the NIH that included the NIMH as well as another organization that dealt with substance abuse. And look what he feels necessary to proclaim. Psychiatry is a branch of medicine. It treats people who are sick. And there's a difference between being sick and not being sick. The fact that in 1978, it is important, feels important to have to actually say that just tells you where we are in this moment in history. So they begin making these manifestos, speaking to journalists, putting themselves out there. And as they begin calling more and more loudly for this common sense return to medicine, they earn themselves a critically important ally. Families. Families of the severely mentally ill who had lived through the failures of deinstitutionalization, the failures of community mental health care, families who at the same time had been told by the Freudian architects of community mental health care that they, and especially, by the way, the mothers, had been responsible for making their children sick in the first place. These families, they're drawn to the biological psychiatrist in the first instance because these folks told them that, no, schizophrenia is a brain disease. And it's no one's fault, least of all yours. These families are drawn to the biological psychiatrist in the second place because these folks also told them that real hope for their children didn't lie in failed community-minded programs. It lay in hard-nosed medical research. But they're not only drawn to these messages, they dramatically amplified them. By 1979, they had organized themselves into a stunningly successful national organization called NAMI, the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill. And NAMI had made it its explicit mission to re-medicalize American psychiatry. Remedicalization is what we families want, as one of them said. And to get what they wanted, they lobbied Congress, they went on television, they set up chapters at every state in every state in a major city. They raised enormous amounts of money. They even started giving away their own grants. And so it came, partly with the help of these angry families, and partly because Freudian psychiatry proved unable to recover from a plethora of self-inflicted wounds, that biology, at least a vision of psychiatry as a biological medical discipline, won the day. In 1980, an initially pretty humdrum project to revise the profession's diagnostic and statistical manual turns into an opportunity to expunge virtually all of the psychoanalytic language from the universe of psychiatric illness and replace them with proposed disorders that were going to be diagnosed using checklists of symptoms that could be reliably replicated and whose actual biological causes, and everyone now hoped, were going to awaited imminent discovery. The 1980 third revision of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual was going to be the book on which the new biological psychiatry was going to forge forward into the future. And we see how 4 years later, 1984, the psychiatrist Nancy Andreasen publishes a book called The Broken Brain and proclaims that we have now lived through a revolution. It's done. Everything that her readers thought they knew about mental illness, she tells them, has been radically turned on its head. Freud's out, biology's in, psychiatry has returned like a prodigal son back to medicine. And no one should be upset about this. No one should mourn the passing of the Freudian era because the new biological perspectives were not only opening the door to more effective treatments, but to a more humane and compassionate approach to mental illness. And so it was clear. Psychiatry's focus turns to biology. But as we take stock of all this, let's remember a few things. The biological psychiatrists had declared victory, but unknown to most of the general public, they had done this in the absence of any radical breakthroughs, any new radical breakthroughs in biological understanding. The lab work from the 50s and 60s had been inspiring, had been wonderful work, but every honest broker in the field knew that there was a really big gap between the findings of the lab that used animal models and the complexity of doing clinical work. Genetics research was slowly starting up again. It hadn't yet yielded anything decisive. Treatment had also not advanced. Psychiatrists were still relying on the same classes of drugs that had been developed in the 1950s. Nothing radically new had emerged since then. All of which is to say that if the field was going to keep its revolutionary promises to the families, to the public, to itself, it had its work cut out for it. So how would things go? What would happen next? Well, initially, a lot of hopes were pinned on the so-called decade of the brain of the 1990s, because this was supposed, among other things, to direct the flow of significant amounts of new federal dollars into biological research on mental disorders. Not as much was directed as people had hoped, but nevertheless, it suggested a concerted commitment now by the same federal government that had once been committed to the Robert Felix vision of social science and psychoanalysis. Now we are committed to a biological vision. And for a while, there was a lot of excitement about the potential, particularly of new brain imaging technologies, PET, fMRI. They could be a game changer, people were saying then, because look, we're able now to create colorful images of the brain's activity levels, in the sense to create images of, in real time, in that sense to create images of the brain in action. As hope being that in due course, imaging technologies like these would allow psychiatrists to look at the brains of their patients in the same way that, a cardiologist looks at the heart of patients using an angiogram. You can look at it, you see what's wrong. Could we see the depressed brain? Could we see the schizophrenic brain? And you can see, look, we've got a brain here. This is the brain on depression. This is the brain not depressed. Looks pretty different. It was pretty cool research. Photographs or images like that were published and were discussed. A lot of beautiful images. But the breakthroughs didn't happen. They didn't happen partly because findings tend to vary across studies. They prove really hard to replicate. They prove really hard to interpret. But most significantly, probably, I would say, none of the brain imaging research turned out to have any practical on-the-ground implications. Tom Insel, who was in 2010 director of the NIMH, looking back at the so-called decade of the brain years, basically says it really didn't move the dial. It didn't move the dial. It didn't help. The story is similarly disappointing in psychopharmacology. There were in the 90s and the new millennia some new variants on the older drugs. Some of you might remember the emergence of the so-called Ssri antidepressants, antidepressants like Prozac. These new variants on the older tricyclic antidepressants did represent an improvement in one sense, in the sense that on balance, a lot of them seem to cause fewer acute side effects, serious side effects. And this was no small thing. but they didn't generally work better than the older drugs. They didn't work for everyone. And over time, their own long-term health consequences began to become a lot more clear. I'm showing you a slide with a little quote from Lauren Slater, whose book Blue Dreams came out in 2018. About 20 years earlier, Lauren Slater had written a book called Prozac Diary, in which she described being one of the first long-term recipients of SSRI treatment. And at that point, she was very high on the drugs and what they did for her. And this is now her second book looking back. And she says, I'm unhealthy, and this is largely due to psychiatry's drugs, and yet I can't live without these drugs. Yet these were the best the field could do, because no one knew where else to look. And for this reason, the real story of psychopharmacology during the years after the biologists declared victory is actually one of the triumph of appearance over reality. The industry invested intensively in marketing all the projects in their vaults, all the products in their vaults. This was a project that was made significantly easier after 1997, because in 1997 the FDA allowed them to advertise. The FDA allowed the industry to advertise directly to consumers. I don't know if any of you remember one influential ad campaign in particular. It featured this adorable guy used to sell a Pfizer antidepressant called Zoloft. By 2001, he was on television, and I think we're going to just take a moment to remember it. For those of you
know when you feel the weight of sadness, you may feel exhausted, hopeless, and anxious. Whatever you do, you feel lonely and don't enjoy the things you once loved. Things just don't feel like they used to. These are some symptoms of depression, a serious medical condition affecting over 20 million Americans. While the cause is unknown, depression may be related to an imbalance of natural chemicals between nerve cells in the brain. Prescription Zoloft works to correct this imbalance. You just shouldn't have to feel this way anymore. Only your doctor can diagnose depression. Zoloft is not for everyone. People taking MAOIs or Pimozide shouldn't take Zoloft. Side effects may include dry mouth, insomnia, sexual side effects, diarrhea, nausea, and sleepiness. Zoloft is not habit-forming. Talk to your doctor about Zoloft, the #1 prescribed brand of its kind. Zoloft. When you know more about what's wrong, you can help make it right.
Look, I'm not sure what you folks would like, but I'd love to hear what you noticed using the chat function or the Q&A function. There's so much to unpack, and if we were in in a real room, we would stop and have a little chat. But this is such a there's both the official message of the commercial, and there's and the kind of sotto voce message behind the scenes. Scott, did you want to jump in and say something?
No, you're on it. If you can see the chat and Q&A, go for it.
I can see. Any reactions? Give people a moment to. Herbert, Cohen, I don't know whether, Herbert, you're able to speak. Immoral. Herbert, why don't you just, so that's what an interesting comment. I so much wish we could talk. Webinars are not, but, some people are, Herbert. Yep. So they're talking about not addicting. There's so much more that I can't unpack, because of lack of time. But part of what they're positioning Zoloft against are the old anxiolytics, like Valium, that had recently experienced a nosedive in public confidence because of the recognition that they were highly addicting. And a lot of these drugs were being now targeted to the nearly normal people who represented a large market for the companies. I just want to see what Herbert wanted to say, and then maybe we can move on.
Am I audible now?
You are.
Okay. So the cartoon says to me that the blob is in the midst of a depression with a dark cloud overhead, cannot be aroused by the little bluebird. And then the message that Zoloft will help comes on, and you hear it. And pretty soon you see the blob is moving forward, bouncing up and down. Zoloft has made a difference. And now the little bluebird is floating ahead of the blob, and everybody's happy. So you almost don't need words for it. It's pretty evident what they're trying to tell you.
And so it's a very happy story, and it's a very quick fix story. I'm sad. I take a medication. I'm better. You might not know that depression is a serious illness and that affects many people. You're not alone. And then there's this moment where they utilize this might have passed too quickly by for you all to have noticed, but where they utilize the research from the 1950s about the effects of the drugs on different levels of neurotransmitters, to say that people suffer from a deficit of certain neurotransmitters, and this puts them back into the system. It's like filling up the gas tank. But then they go on to say, but actually the cause of depression is unknown. They say that quite quickly because there was no consensus that this laboratory work had demonstrated anything definitive about the origins of human depression, or that even that all human depression had the same kinds of causes. Susan?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So my oldest sister, this is so timely because recently on NPR, I heard on a local NPR station, 50th anniversary of Marvin Gaye's What's Going On. Mm-hmm. And I'm the youngest of five. My oldest sister, born in 1959, took her own life in 1998 due to depression. And I know that at the time of her death, the doctor she was seeing was at NIMH, Dr. Gold. So that would have been, if she passed away in 1998, the late 1990s. After that, there was Governor of Massachusetts, or somehow within that, Michael Dukakis and Kitty Dukakis, who was very public about her depression and her treatments. And this is all very
you've lived through this history.
Yeah. And so I just think of things like, I just remember she had treatment, I think it was categorized as treatment resistant, profound major depression, whatever it was, and diagnosed when she was in college. She was very successful, very intelligent, advanced degrees, married to a person who was, they lived in Washington, D.C. But I think the world was crushing for her. And
thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. So I don't know. I think all these years later, like I stood at my kitchen sink the other day listening to the Marvin Gaye tribute, and spontaneously and unexpectedly just burst into tears. And not because that music is still relevant today, because it is, and it's unfortunate the reasons that it's still relevant, but because I miss her and I still have questions. And so some of the stuff that you're talking about is helpful to hear, but really frustrating to hear.
Thank you for sharing. I'm also now looking at the chat. There's a lot of wonderful comments and some pushback and things that I'd love to come back to. And I'm reading through all of them. And you're right about lithium. I'm not telling the story of lithium. It's a interesting kind of, well, anyway, we should come back to all of these things. Let me just kind of pick up my story. And there's a lot of nuance and a lot of more things to say, but let me pick up my story and take it to the end, and then we can open it back up again.
Let
me just move back because I want to just, I'm talking still about, just to remind us about, the pharmaceutical industry in the post-revolution, so to speak, years. We just looked at the ad of Zoloft from 2001 for depression, but I want you to look at kind of a strange thing that then happens 3 years later. The blob shows up in an ad in 2004, no longer suffering from depression, but instead he's at a party suffering from a then little known disorder called social anxiety disorder. And the very same announcer, this is also ran as a television ad, who sympathetically narrates his experience with depression, now narrates his experience with excruciating shyness, suggesting that Zoloft could help. So why does this happen? Because Pfizer's patent on Zoloft as an antidepressant is getting ready to expire. They don't have any new big breakout drugs in the pipeline. And so they and a lot of people in the industry had responded by directing their efforts towards getting FDA approval to use and advertise these older drugs for new markets, including, as we see here, the large and potentially really lucrative anxiety market. And this buys them some time, but they're actually not doing well by 2010. It's becoming clear that on top of everything else, they had a serious placebo problem. Of course, to get through a trial, drugs have to outperform the placebo effect. Companies were finding that this was getting harder and harder to do. There's a lot to say about the strange phenomenon in which the placebo effect seemed to be stronger than it used to be, especially around in trials that were testing drugs for anxiety and depression and pain. We could revisit this about, why people think this might have been going on, but, no one knew for sure why. And in the end, it was less important to them to figure out why and more important to them to figure out, can they still make money in this industry? And by around 2010, a lot of them begin to conclude no. They begin to leave the field. They just can't figure out any new ways to make the big money anymore. And this is why if you go onto the websites of most of the big pharmaceutical companies that used to be at the center of psychopharmacological work, psychiatric drugs aren't their focus anymore. I don't know if you can look at see what they're focusing on, what their clinical trials are on. They are betting on other horses. They're particularly now investing in oncology. Now, since I wrote Mind Fixers, this was published in the mid 2019. Something happened in the field. A rise of a new interest in the possibility of maybe a new breakout moment in that would involve repurposing certain psychedelic drugs like ketamine, psilocybin, all drugs with histories as street drugs, as recreational drugs, whether you could repurpose them into psychiatric medications. It's an open question. This is a really interesting story to me. It's an unfinished story. It's an open question whether or not this is enough to bring the big industries back in, or where this story is going to go. But meanwhile, Psychiatry's diagnostic manual, the so-called DSM, which was hailed, as I mentioned, once as the foundational text for the new medically minded psychiatry. Also by 2010, 11, 12, falling into a state of intense malaise. It's now under attack, and not just by grumpy old outsiders, anti-psychiatry people. You'd had a lot of that since much, much earlier. It's under attack now by informed insiders. And in one particularly notorious moment, which I remember personally very well, 2013. I mentioned before Tom Insel, now the former NIMH director. He declared the DSM has not only failed to deliver on its promise to drive biological research, it had impeded research like this. And in one of, I think, the most telling statements, he says, biology never read that book. That same book that was actually supposed to put psychiatry on a biological basis. I've talked to people at the NIMH. I had the privilege of speaking to some of them last February, just before the pandemic hit, about not so much this book directly, but sort of about the history of their own institution and where it fits into the current moment. And it was pretty clear to me, talking to them, that they did not see a clear way forward. They had developed something called the RDoC, that was meant to be an alternative to the DSM, but they were very, I think, disillusioned with it. And, it remained a kind of unfinished piece of business. Look, there's more to say. A lot of this, as the comments have been showing, could and should be nuanced, but the upshot for me, at least, is pretty clear. Back in the 1980s, a revolution prematurely declared in advance of actual victory has also now begun to falter in the face of a growing backlash, a growing skepticism, a growing sense that we need a reset. The optimistic era of what I now think of as the old biological psychiatry that emerged out of the crisis period of the late 70s and 80s, I think it's running into the sands. And I think more and more people see this, even if, and this takes me back to where I began right at the beginning of my talk, even if many of them are more confused than they need to be, than they should be, about how this happened. So I hope that this story that I've tried to outline for all of you this evening has helped us to better understand a little bit why we've ended where we have. But I also hope that, it not just be an end in itself, that it serve as a prologue to what I'd said before I think is needed next, a reset. And, what that reset should look like, I'd love to think with all of you together about this, but I'll end by suggesting, something that, of course, I wouldn't have said 12 months ago. But, the last 12 months have been a catalyst for appreciating a wide range of profound mental health challenges of a sort that, if anything, have only heightened my sense of the urgency to have new kinds of conversations about the future of psychiatry. I think of the past year and I ask myself, how well equipped is our biologically inflected psychiatry that has taken its direction from the visions of the 1980s revolutionaries, and how well equipped is it to deal with things like deferred grief, isolation, racial trauma? And if it's not well equipped, who is? I'll tell you one last story. The director of the NIMH, I taught a class in the fall that dealt with what it was called Mental Health Matters, and it dealt with the kind of unfinished business of psychiatry that was most salient in our own moment. And and we had a few guests come, and one of the guests was the director of the NIMH, and he was great, and it was wonderful that he was willing to take time out of his busy schedule to speak with undergraduates. But I was struck by the disconnect between what was on the minds of the students and the urgent questions they had and how he thought about psychiatry's mission. So we have a story that's in process now, whose end is unclear, and that we all in different ways have the potential to help to write. Why don't I stop with that? I will stop screen sharing. I would love to chat with all of you. It's just about 8 o'clock. I know that we're not supposed to go too much after 8, but I was encouraged to not worry too much about that.
And do you mind if we take a question or two, or would you like to just read off some?
No, please. I'd love to hear from real people, like actual voices. And thank you, John. Please, I've got, are you going to do this? Are you going to make people pop up?
Yes, if anyone wants to raise their hand, I can let them do that.
We've got a bunch of people. We've got some hand raising. We've got, I mean, I think in terms of genomics, let me take a question from Elizabeth. And, you know, if other people on the panel, like Scott, if you want to pop back into the world and let us see you, you know, we can make it a more of a conversation. I'm not a medical doctor. I mean, I know, Scott, you're not a psychiatrist. I don't know whether anyone of the panel is, but there may well be some in the audience. So, you know, the question, you know, but you might have things to say. Will genomics get us anywhere further? So one of my good friends is Steve Hyman, who heads up a research center that's affiliated with the Broad. And he is pretty bullish about the future, particularly of big data, you know, forms of analysis of genetic patterns to eventually yield understandings of, you know, untangle the diagnostic confusion that, you know, was laid bare by the failures of the DSM. But he also says, you know, it depends a little bit. Do we think that genomics will get us anywhere further? It depends on your timeline. You know, his view is that, you know, it's going to be 40 years before we have anything that he thinks, you know, is useful. So it may just not be that, you know, there is a, you know, that a biological perspective or biological approach to psychiatry is intrinsically doomed, or that I'm anti-biology. But when you promise people a revolution and you can't deliver tangible goods in a reasonable framework of time, then it does lead to backlash. And so one of my views about, not that anyone asked yet, about like what the reset should be, would be a different kind of stance vis-a-vis the public, a different kind of a level of honesty, a level of humility, and a willingness to look for what helps and not only follow the science. In the kind of conventional, not, you know, there's beautiful science, but what helps? Do you want to jump somebody else in?
Claudio, if you'd like to ask a question.
Yeah, the question, hi, that's a great talk, and I'm glad to be part of it. I'm a psychiatrist, a clinician. That's all what I've done in my adult life. And I think there is a problem, which I call confusion, a huge confusion, where the psychological elements of all of us, our humanity, are suffering. It's difficult sometimes to explain. And biology seems to be the default language to try to explain human suffering. Yes. And I think that's a big problem right there. I'm not sure if you can elaborate or make it, I don't know. I don't have the answer, okay?
One of the things that I've gotten a little bit of flack for, but that I want to defend, is that mental suffering is a bigger category than mental illness.
That's correct. Yes, for sure.
And that all forms of suffering deserve care. Yeah. But not all forms of suffering necessarily require medical care in the narrow understanding. Mm-hmm. And we're not, because we don't know enough about the origins of the forms, forms of distress that may not have their source in disease, and those that don't. And because the people who we have narrowed the numbers, the range of helpers that we consider respectable. We tend to perpetuate the myth that all forms of suffering need a diagnosis, and in turn, therefore, not everybody believes this, but require some kind of ultimately a biological explanation, or they're not really diseases. But if we could imagine a kind of a ecology of caregivers some of whom were medically focused and some of whom were focused on the social conditions of people's mental distress, and some of whom perhaps were did psychotherapy and so on. And if we could flatten the hierarchies that I think currently stymie such efforts, maybe we could do a better job in the here and now for patients, even while, the medical project should move forward. It just, though, it won't move forward probably in a time frame that will satisfy, most people. I remember in 2013, wait, what did I say? Not psychotics, but psychedelics. Did I misspeak? Oh, no, you misspoke. I see. Let me just go. In 2013, I was at the APA for various reasons. 2013 was when Insul, made his remark that, the NIMH is not going to use the DSM anymore as the basis for further biological research. And I remember talking to some women. I think they came from a clinic in Oklahoma, and they were lovely women. And they said, well, what are we supposed to do? We have sick people now. We don't have time to let, the big guys, fight it all out over the next however many numbers of years. We need something, and I think it's those women that I feel a strong kind of responsibility. People like that, I feel a strong responsibility for. So let me see what else. There's an awful lot of amazing stuff going on in the chat, and there's so many of you. It's amazing, and I'm so pleased so many of you came, including one of my former students who wants to say that, Ivan, many psychiatrists get defensive about the value of biological research, often count the emergence of CBT as a win. So where does CBT fit? I think it's a great question, Ivan, of course. So the reason it's counted as a win is it's evidence-based. It followed the methodologies that the drug trials also follow. It also was even pitted at one point in the late 1970s, maybe since, but I'm aware of the, this sort of famous pitting of CBT against the tricyclic antidepressants, and it came out ahead. And I do think that it is a nuance to the story around that would say that the biological psychiatry today is all about drugs. Well, CBT is a gracious exception to the rule because it played by the rules. Let me see what else there is. So somebody's asking about World War I. I think I need some help, Scott, navigating this.
Sure.
I don't answer everybody.
Ton of good questions. Steve Boyd says, I'm an economist, and we have a similar public narrative. Before the Great Depression, we were clueless, but now we know how to quote-unquote treat recessions. But behind closed doors, we know we often don't have the answers.
That's wonderful.
Do you think psychiatry is qualitatively different from other soft sciences that overhype their expertise?
Say, what was the last bit of the question? I'm looking for that.
Sure. Do you think psychiatry is qualitatively different from other soft sciences that overhype their expertise?
I love that question. I don't know the answer. I had no idea that this was a narrative in economics. I do think that psychiatry has been, the kind of, the poor kid on the block in terms of the other medical professions. So, it's always looking over its shoulder at the other medical professions that seem more scientific, seem more successful. And, in that sense, I'm sure I'm not sure, but I imagine it's not unique, but within medicine, it has a particularly fragile status, and in some ways of its own making, because it has repeatedly, periodically, but repeatedly declared it's not actually medical. It's not really about medicine. And that was in the most salient moment was in after the Second World War. We're about saving the troubled souls of the nation. And this, in the end, this kind of hubris, as well as this taking on tasks that would far outside of potentially, arguably, of their expertise, eventually comes back to bite them. What else? Yeah, so it's just so some people are saying that the SSRIs are helpful, the SNRI. I think I hope that there was nothing that I said that would lead people to lead anyone to come to the conclusion that I don't think that the medications can help people. But the fact is, you only have to talk to people. There are many fewer than there used to be who remember the age before drugs, to be grateful that we live in an age with drugs, with medication, the possibility of medication. But they are, they don't work for everyone. They sometimes poop out, and they have side effects, and they were all empirically discovered. And it was only after the drugs came online that that people attempt to sort of fit to those biological explanations rooted in how the drugs work. Other questions? I see Vicky Wyeth. I remember you. Hi, Vicky. Nice to see you.
John, did you have a question?
Susan Carr has a question. Can we ask Susan to get on?
Yeah, so I'm just unmuting, and I just wanted to say earlier when you really wanted comments about those advertisements. I didn't mean to overshare. This has all just been very timely for me. Again, the Marvin Gaye anniversary, the age of my sister. But I remember back now after her death, because I'm the youngest and she was the oldest, and we were all born in short order, that my sister, the second oldest, said, I feel like she just needed to detox. And what she meant, because my sister didn't really have, my passed away sister, Julie, didn't have a substance abuse problem. But I think what my sister Sheila was saying to me was because they kept trying different pharmaceuticals and then they would lose efficacy. And even Dr. Gold from NIMH back then, again, 1998, said that death, he said, I had plenty of patients for whom suicide was just really a concern, but your sister wasn't one of them. And he said that the death would haunt him for the rest of his life. And even back then he was very old. So he reminded me of Arthur Fiedler. He just had the shock of white hair. And so, I hope I didn't overshare earlier, but this is just all kind of blowing me away.
Very moving. Very moving. Thank you for sharing. I think it's brave of you and very moving. There's a question I'd like to jump into because I think it's a really interesting one. Rich Parker asks, were you critical or supportive of NAMI or neither? Both, I think, is the answer. I think NAMI is starts off as a really, really impressive grassroots organization that speaks truth to power. You have a lot of these, housewives who had never been in the public eye, particularly a woman named, Eve Oliphant in 1977, gets onto a podium before the World Psychiatric Association, and she basically says, we parents failed to understand why the families of a child with leukemia were treated with compassion and care, but the families of a child with schizophrenia were treated with scorn. And I don't know what the psychiatric, people in the audience had to say, but they must have felt very uncomfortable. The fact that they had been, they were, the old trope of the schizophrenogenic mother, the mothers that drive their children crazy. They pushed back about that, and they pushed for care for their kids. What happens, I think, to them? So I really admire that. I admire that story. There's a quite wonderful documentary about NAMI you can have to buy it. It's a little bit hard to track down, but it's called When Medicine Got It Wrong. and it includes a lot of interviews with these folk. What does, though, happen with NAMI, sort of 10 years then down the line, is they harden. They don't listen as well as I think one might want to what their own children feel. It's a lot about what's important to them. And you see actually a situation in which the family advocacy movements are in tension with the patient advocacy movements that are asking for more autonomy and asking not to be immediately biologized, and not to have people come to the conclusion that more biological research is the most important thing for them. So in a certain strange way, the family advocacy and the patient advocacy end up at loggerheads with one another. And I think that is a telling moment that, suggests, a certain hardening that I'm more critical of. They also start taking a lot of money from the pharmaceutical industry because it realizes that they're an important amplifier for messages that suit their own commercial interests. What else should we, it's now 20 after 8 people, friends, and we're starting to lose participants, but maybe we could take the 3 participants who raised their hand. What do you think, Scott?
Sounds good.
Then, if people want to send me an email, if I'm interesting enough to have the conversation continue, post this session, I'm ridiculously easy to find. Just Google Ann Harrington Harvard and my email will come up on one website or another, and I'd be happy to chat in that form. But maybe these final 3 participants who have raised their hand. They are Richard Parker, or maybe these are from before.
So Rich Parker's
he's already spoken. Let me see. There's a question about
John, did you have a question?
I have a comment. I'm a Harvard-trained psychopharmacologist, and I've lived through this whole thing. And in the 50s, 3 out of 4 hospital beds were occupied by psychiatric patients. The drugs did have a profound effect in getting them out of the hospital, but they never got very good psychopharmacology follow-up. It's interesting about the depression. I agree with you. A lot of these studies that show placebo almost as good as the active drug, part of the problem there is making the diagnosis correctly. And the average psychiatrist has trouble doing that. If people are depressed and have racing thoughts and they're treated with an antidepressant, they become worse and in some cases suicidal. You see this particularly among adolescents. So that's a very important distinction that often is lost on psychiatrists. And a lot of these people are treated by general practitioners or primary care doctors.
Thank you. So you've made 2 interesting sort of separate points. One about the antidepressants and the problems of it was related to another question about like how come it works sometimes and sometimes it's unhelpful or doesn't work, and some of this has to do with the fact that we probably have very heterogeneous groups all receiving the same diagnosis.
I like to say it's painting by numbers.
Mm-hmm.
The average psychiatrist will see depression and they give an antidepressant, and in a lot of cases that makes it worse. So the question of racing thoughts is critical.
And we don't really know what our diseases are.
Oh, I think depression, I have what I call Keenly's rule. The more severe the mental illness, the more likely it is to be biological, to have a biological treatment, and to have a genetic component.
I don't disbelieve that. I mean, I'm persuaded that there has to be biology. Of course, the brain is an organ. It can malfunction. Let me come back to your other point about the fact that the antipsychotics, chlorpromazine and Haldol and so on, did help. Did make a difference, but the problem had to do then with the lack of follow-up care. And this is a consequence of, I think, a kind of Faustian bargain that the states and the federal government entered into together. The states would build the community mental health centers that were supposed to do the aftercare after the patients were deinstitutionalized. The federal government built those. The states were supposed to then provide the staffing and the funding for the staffing. And they failed to really pony up enough money to allow these centers to be adequately staffed to allow the kind of care for the severely chronically mentally ill that was necessary.
But the model they used, and Bill Anderson and I wrote a letter to the New England Journal back then, they used the psychosocial model and downplayed the medical model. And our point was only in the severely mentally ill. I agree. People that are unhappy or have existential questions probably don't need antidepressants. The psychiatry should be broad, but when it comes to the severely ill, it should be better focused and should be more careful. Also, I actually have a treatment for drug addiction, but that's another story for another day.
So this is so helpful and interesting to hear from you. I mean, I think the argument that, as we think about the reset, one possibility, and I'm not completely persuaded, but nevertheless, it would be for psychiatry to narrow its gaze to this cohort of patients who you called the severely mentally ill, who probably have some kind of a biologically based disorder, and for the nearly normals, the people who are suffering but may not have a disease, should be cared for by other kinds of experts.
Well, that's actually going on. I would bet that 90% of the psychotherapy is done by social workers.
I think that's not wrong, but there's all sort of under the rubric of the medical model. They still need a DSM diagnosis for the.
Well, that's an insurance. I will agree with you. No, insurance controls things.
Thank you so much for these comments. I think Byron Good has raised his hand. I'd love to hear from Byron. Byron, you are free to talk.
It's a lovely story. And I think providing this kind of macro narrative is really important. I would tell a slightly different story, and I would about one small piece of this, not small piece, about the discovery that almost 2/3 of people who have schizophrenia and live in the community over their lifetime recover.
Yes.
And that raises questions about, A, what kind of disease is this? What kind of brain reconstruction happens in this process? But also what we know is that it makes a huge amount of difference what kind of psychosocial care is given for precisely those conditions, the most severe mental illnesses that we have just been talking about over the last 5 minutes. The last 5 minutes, yes, I believe schizophrenia is deeply biological, but I also think that the most effective treatments are often the psychosocial treatments, and the data suggests that all kinds of psychosocial treatments produce recovery, whereas, I work in a place in Indonesia where people often have no medication. I have no romance for untreated schizophrenia. I spend my life with people with untreated schizophrenia. It's horrible. But antipsychotics are not the cause for people recovering. Other things are.
I think that's wonderful, and people like medical anthropologists should be talking. You should be integrated. I mean, you are integrated, Byron, into conversations because you have a very prominent sort of sort of position in the field. But I think that is, I really completely agree. Therefore want to nuance what I said before. That even people who have a biological, a disorder that has a biological root doesn't mean they're not still people. Doesn't mean that they don't respond to relationships or to, their set and setting. And it doesn't mean that, may be more effective than a new script for a stronger antipsychotic would be getting them their own apartment or integrating them into some kind of supported workplace. There was a, I don't know why this comes to mind, but there was, as I do know, there was a study done in the late 50s, maybe you even know about it, Byron, of insulin shock therapy, which basically, to assess, because which was in the time in the 1930s and 40s deemed like really, really successful in curing schizophrenia or in making a lot of schizophrenic patients much better. The study, it was, I think the author's name was Bourne, B-O-U-R-N-E, Harold Bourne. Harold Bourne, I think it was 1955, he came out with a study in which he basically said that insulin shock, it was a meta-analysis or a sort of meta-analysis that there's no evidence that as a specific treatment it worked, but there's considerable evidence that all of the intensive nursing and care and attention that was given to this population of patients did them enormous good. In a time when most chronic schizophrenics were seen as helpless and incapable of recovery, they were plucked out of these cavernous awful wards and brought into the insulin ward. And there were nursing pamphlets manuals at the time that said, that trained nurses to do all sorts of things like flower arranging and puzzles and cheerful walks. And the doctors came in, and they had all of this high-tech stuff. Inadvertently, he said this was extensive experiment in milieu therapy for a cohort of patients that were believed to have a serious biological defect. So I think, I think it's spot on what you say. So I think we've lost about half the audience, not lost, but people have lives. It's 8:30, and I was told by no means go beyond 8:30 just because Zoom is tiring. I'm so sorry I can't address all of these amazingly interesting questions. We really, really appreciate how engaged the audience is, and I'm deeply sorry we have to do it in this odd format. So there's responses to the insulin. There was no placebo control. About the insulin therapy. I think that the Harold Bourne paper from 1955, is a kind of underappreciated gem, really worth reading. It didn't get that much attention at the time, but very insightful. But Scott, what do you think? Should we wrap up?
I think so. No one's kicking us out of the room, but I think you've generated a fantastic conversation. Great talk. Catherine Myers, great job getting us all engage with the audience, and thank you so much to the audience members for your great questions. And thank you very much for wonderful talk and wonderful.